Strasbourg, July 1518. Frau Troffea stepped into the narrow street outside her house and began to dance. Nothing unusual about that, except she didn't stop. Not when the sun set, not when her husband begged her to come inside, not when her feet started bleeding through her shoes. By the third day, Frau Troffea was still dancing. Her feet had become raw masses of torn flesh and exposed bone. Blood pooled beneath her as she spun and jerked in movements that no longer resembled anything human. Her face had gone slack, eyes rolled back, but her body kept moving like a puppet with tangled strings. Neighbors gathered to watch this impossible spectacle, this woman who seemed possessed by some unholy rhythm that wouldn't release her. Within a week, 34 others had joined her. They danced in the streets, in their homes, anywhere their bodies carried them. Some collapsed from exhaustion, hearts giving out mid-spin. Their corpses would hit the ground, and the other dancers would simply step over them, continuing their grotesque ballet. The sound of shuffling feet and labored breathing filled Strasbourg's streets day and night, punctuated by the occasional thud of another body hitting the cobblestones. But here's where it gets truly insane. The city council and local physicians decided they knew exactly how to cure this dancing plague. Their solution? Build wooden stages throughout the city and hire professional musicians to play constantly. Their medical theory was that the afflicted needed to dance it out of their system. So they created an official infrastructure for what was essentially a death march. The stages became execution platforms. Dancers who had already been moving for days were now given unlimited space and musical accompaniment to continue destroying themselves. Bones snapped audibly as dancers spun on broken ankles. Skin fell away in strips from feet that had been dancing for weeks. The stench of gangrene mixed with the smell of fresh blood and human waste as dancers lost control of their bodily functions but never stopped moving. Eyewitness accounts describe dancers whose feet had worn down to exposed bones still shuffling in place, leaving trails of blood and fragments of flesh across the wooden stages. Some tried to tie themselves to posts to stop moving, but their bodies would thrash so violently they'd dislocate their own shoulders. Others begged spectators to kill them, to end the torment, but medieval law forbade such mercy. The musicians played for hours, then days, their fingers bleeding on their instruments as they provided the soundtrack to this mass death event. They were paid by the city to keep playing, no matter how many dancers collapsed and died in front of them. The stages had to be cleaned multiple times per day, workers shoveling away the accumulated blood, skin fragments and other biological debris that collected in ankle-deep pools. Medical records from the period note that approximately 15 people were dying per day at the height of the plague. Not from any disease that medical science could identify, but from sheer physical exhaustion and the catastrophic damage their bodies sustained from non-stop movement. Hearts exploded from overexertion. Lungs collapsed. Brains swelled from dehydration and overheating until dancers started seizing, still moving their limbs in dancing motions even as they convulsed. The truly horrifying part? This wasn't an isolated incident. Dancing plagues had struck other European cities throughout the medieval period, but Strasbourg's was the largest and best documented. And nobody, not the doctors, not the priests, not the city officials, had any real understanding of what was causing it or how to stop it. Some physicians blamed hot blood and prescribed bloodletting, which only weakened the dancers further. Priests performed exorcisms, screaming prayers over writhing bodies that wouldn't stop moving. Astrologers blamed planetary alignments. Everyone had a theory, but the dancers kept dancing, kept dying, and kept being replaced by new victims who would suddenly feel the irresistible urge to move and couldn't stop until their bodies gave out completely. By the time the dancing plague finally ended in September, after nearly 2 months, between 50 and 400 people had danced themselves to death in Strasbourg's streets. The exact number is disputed because record-keeping became chaotic as the death toll mounted. Bodies piled up faster than they could be properly counted or buried. But the nightmare didn't end with the last dancer's death, because this was just the beginning of understanding how medieval plagues could turn the human body into an instrument of its own destruction in ways that defied all logic and reason. England, summer of 1485. A soldier in King Henry VII's army went to sleep feeling perfectly healthy. 6 hours later, he was dead, his body so soaked in sweat that the stench could be detected from across the military camp. This wasn't ordinary perspiration. This was something that turned the human body into a grotesque fountain of its own fluids. The sweating sickness earned its name from its most distinctive and disgusting symptom. Victims would suddenly begin sweating so profusely that their clothes would become completely drenched within minutes. Not gradually damp, but soaking wet, as if they'd been submerged in water. The sweat itself had a peculiar, nauseating odor that witnesses described as sweet and rotten simultaneously, like decaying fruit mixed with infected wounds. But the sweat was just the opening act of this disease's horror show. Within an hour of the first sweat breaking, victims would develop a fever so intense that observers claimed you could feel the heat radiating from their bodies at arm's length. The fever would climb so high, so fast, that many patients would become delirious almost immediately. They'd scream about demons, claw at their own skin, or try to throw themselves from windows to escape the sensation of being cooked from the inside. The disease moved through its victims with terrifying speed. Stage 1. The sudden onset of sweating and chills. Stage 2. Severe headache and muscle pain so intense that grown men would weep like children. Stage 3. The fever spike that brought delirium and confusion. Stage 4. Extreme exhaustion, where victims couldn't lift their heads from their pillows. Stage 5. Death, usually occurring between 3 and 18 hours after the first symptom appeared. What made the sweating sickness particularly nightmarish was its preference for the healthy and wealthy. Unlike most medieval diseases that targeted the weak, malnourished, and poor, this plague seemed to specifically hunt down people in their prime. Young men between 15 and 45 were the primary victims. The robust, the strong, the ones who should have been able to fight off illness, were dropping dead within hours, while frail elderly people and young children often survived. Medical records from the period describe the physical deterioration in grotesque detail. After the initial fever spike, victims' skin would take on a grayish pallor despite the heat pouring off their bodies. Their eyes would sink back into their skulls, surrounded by dark circles that made them look like corpses before they'd actually died. The constant sweating would leave them so dehydrated that their lips would crack and bleed, their tongues would swell, and their skin would lose all elasticity. The worst cases involved what physicians called the sleeping death. Some victims would fall into a deep sleep during the exhaustion phase, and if they were allowed to continue sleeping, they would simply never wake up. Their bodies would keep sweating, the fever would keep climbing, and they would die in their sleep, often with expressions of agony frozen on their faces that suggested their dreams had been anything but peaceful. Physicians prescribed the most absurd treatments based on medieval medical theory. Victims were wrapped in layers of wool blankets to sweat out the poison, which actually accelerated their deaths from heat stroke. They were given wine and spices to balance their humors, which dehydrated them further. Bloodletting was prescribed liberally, removing precious fluids from bodies already critically dehydrated from the sweating. The disease hit England 5 separate times between 1485 and 1551, each outbreak more devastating than the last. The 1528 outbreak was particularly catastrophic. Contemporary accounts describe entire households dying within a single day. A family would sit down to breakfast together, and by dinner time, half of them would be corpses soaked in their own sweat, their bodies already beginning to decompose in the summer heat. London during the height of the 1528 outbreak became a city of the dead. Business stopped because merchants were too terrified to interact with customers who might be carrying the disease. Churches couldn't keep up with burial demands. Bodies were stacked in the streets, all of them drenched in sweat even hours after death, as if the disease continued to wring fluid from corpses. The psychological terror was as devastating as the physical disease. People became paranoid about any sensation of warmth or moisture on their skin. A hot day could trigger panic attacks. Someone who'd been exercising and started sweating normally would be abandoned by their companions. left alone to potentially die because nobody wanted to risk being near them. King Henry VIII fled London multiple times to escape the sweating sickness, moving between royal residences and essentially abandoning his capital to save his own life. The disease terrified him so much that he would change locations every few days during outbreaks, convinced that staying mobile would protect him. His courtiers died around him, but Henry survived, leading him to believe he had divine protection while everyone else was expendable. Then, as mysteriously as it had appeared, the sweating sickness vanished after 1551. It never returned to England or anywhere else. Modern medical researchers still debate what it actually was. Some believe it was a hantavirus, similar to what causes modern hemorrhagic fevers. Others think it might have been an influenza strain that mutated itself out of existence. The truth is, nobody knows what killed thousands of people in England over those 66 years. What we do know is this. The sweating sickness demonstrated that medieval plagues didn't need months or years to devastate a population. They could do it in hours, turning healthy human beings into fever-racked, sweat-drenched corpses before the sun set on the day they first felt unwell. And the speed of death somehow made it even more terrifying than slower killers. But if you think a disease that kills in 24 hours is the worst the medieval world had to offer, you haven't heard about the plague that made people watch their own bodies rot away while they were still alive and fully conscious. France, 994 AD. A peasant woman woke up with a tingling sensation in her fingers. By evening, her hands had turned black. 3 days later, her fingers fell off into her lap while she was eating dinner. She was still alive, still conscious, still able to feel everything as her body rotted away piece by piece. St. Anthony's fire, known medically as ergotism, was caused by a fungus that grew on rye grain during wet, cool summers. When people ate bread made from infected grain, they were essentially poisoning themselves with a substance related to LSD. But unlike a bad drug trip, this poison didn't just mess with your mind. It destroyed your body in the most grotesque ways imaginable. The disease came in 2 forms, and both were absolutely horrific. The gangrenous form caused blood vessels to constrict so severely that blood flow to the extremities would completely stop. Without blood, the tissue would die and rot while still attached to the living body. Victims would watch their fingers and toes turn from pink to purple to black to green as gangrene set in. The flesh would become soft and putrid, and eventually, the dead parts would simply separate from the living tissue. Contemporary accounts describe victims whose feet would fall off while they were walking. They'd take a step, and their foot would detach at the ankle, leaving them standing on a bleeding stump while their severed foot lay behind them on the ground. Some people lost all 4 limbs this way, becoming limbless trunks that somehow remained alive and aware through the entire process. The smell was indescribable. Rotting human flesh has a particular odor that's distinct from any other kind of decay. It's sweet and putrid and overwhelming, and it clung to victims like a shroud. People with ergotism could be identified from across a village just by the stench of their own decomposition. Families would abandon their infected relatives, unable to bear the smell or the sight of their loved ones literally falling apart. But the gangrenous form wasn't even the worst version. The convulsive form of ergotism attacked the nervous system, causing hallucinations, muscle spasms, and sensations that victims described as feeling like they were being burned alive from the inside. Hence the name, St. Anthony's fire. People would scream that flames were consuming their bodies, that demons were roasting them on invisible spits, that their blood had turned to molten metal in their veins. The convulsions were violent enough to break bones. Victims would thrash so hard that they'd dislocate their own joints, fracture their spines, or bash their heads against walls until their skulls cracked. Some would bite through their own tongues during seizures. Others would claw at their skin, trying to extinguish the fire they felt burning inside them, tearing off strips of flesh and leaving themselves covered in self-inflicted wounds that would then become infected. The hallucinations were particularly horrific because they were consistent across victims. Almost everyone with convulsive ergotism reported seeing demons, specifically demons that were trying to drag them to hell. They'd see horned creatures with burning eyes, feel claws tearing at their flesh, hear voices telling them they were damned. In an era when people believed absolutely in the reality of hell and demonic possession, these hallucinations weren't just frightening, they were confirmation of their worst spiritual fears. Entire villages would be affected simultaneously when the local grain supply was contaminated. Imagine a community where dozens of people are simultaneously losing limbs to gangrene, having violent seizures, and screaming about demons. The psychological impact was devastating. Neighbors would turn on each other, convinced that witchcraft was responsible. Priests would perform mass exorcisms that only made things worse because the physical stress of the rituals would trigger more seizures and heart attacks. The church, specifically the Order of St. Anthony, built hospitals to treat ergotism victims. But here's the truly cynical part. They didn't actually cure anyone. What they did was move victims away from the contaminated grain supply by bringing them to the hospitals, where they were fed uncontaminated food. The symptoms would gradually improve, and the church would claim it was a miracle from St. Anthony. They built their entire reputation and wealth on what was essentially a geographic cure, while letting people believe it was divine intervention. Some victims would partially recover, left with stumps where their limbs had been, or permanent neurological damage from the convulsions. These survivors became beggars, displaying their missing fingers and blackened stumps to earn sympathy in coins. Medieval cities had entire districts populated by ergotism survivors, communities of the mutilated who'd lost their ability to work and had no choice but to rely on charity. The worst cases involved pregnant women. The same substance that caused gangrene and convulsions also triggered powerful uterine contractions. Pregnant women with ergotism would go into premature labor, often delivering dead or severely deformed babies. Some would hemorrhage so severely during these ergot-induced miscarriages that they'd bleed to death. Others would survive the miscarriage only to develop gangrene in their extremities days later. Medical understanding of ergotism wouldn't come for centuries. Medieval physicians blamed everything from bad air to planetary alignments to moral corruption. They prescribed useless treatments like prayer, fasting, and pilgrimage. Some doctors recommended amputation of gangrenous limbs, which was actually somewhat effective if done early enough, but medieval surgical techniques meant that most amputation patients died from infection or blood loss anyway. The last major ergotism outbreak in Western Europe occurred in 1951 in a French village called Pont Saint-Esprit. Even in the modern era, contaminated flour caused mass hallucinations, convulsions, and several deaths before doctors figured out what was happening. It proved that this medieval nightmare could return at any time if grain storage and food safety protocols failed. But St. Anthony's fire, horrific as it was, at least had a clear cause once scientists figured it out. The next plague on our list was far more mysterious, striking repeatedly with no warning and no explanation, targeting victims with such specific precision that it seemed almost intelligent in its cruelty. England, 1507. 22 years after the first outbreak of the sweating sickness, it came back. And this time people knew what was coming. The terror was worse because they'd seen it before, buried hundreds of victims before, and had absolutely no more understanding of how to stop it than they did the first time. The second outbreak killed thousands within weeks. But what made this recurrence particularly nightmarish was the paranoia it generated. People who'd survived the first epidemic knew exactly what those initial symptoms meant. The moment they felt warm or noticed any moisture on their skin, they'd be gripped by absolute panic. Some people died from heart attacks brought on by fear before the disease even had a chance to develop. Physicians tried everything they could think of to prevent infection. They prescribed keeping all windows closed to prevent bad air from entering, which actually made things worse by creating hot, stuffy environments that mimicked the fever symptoms they were trying to avoid. They recommended avoiding all physical exertion, which led to people becoming so sedentary that their health deteriorated from lack of movement. Every attempted cure seemed to make the situation worse. The wealthy tried to flee to the countryside, believing that London's crowded conditions were responsible for the disease's spread. But the sweating sickness followed them. It appeared in rural villages, in isolated estates, in places that had no contact with infected areas. It was as if the disease could materialize out of nowhere, striking down whoever it wanted regardless of precautions. The third outbreak in 1517 introduced a new horror. The disease was evolving. Victims were now experiencing additional symptoms, including severe nosebleeds that wouldn't stop, bleeding from the gums, and in the worst cases, bleeding from the eyes. Some patients would essentially hemorrhage to death while simultaneously sweating themselves into dehydration. Their bodies were losing fluid through every possible avenue until there was nothing left. By the fourth outbreak in 1528, the paranoia had reached such heights that people were taking absurd and dangerous preventive measures. Some refused to sleep at all, believing that sleep triggered the disease's lethal phase. They'd stay awake for days until exhaustion-induced hallucinations made them think they'd contracted the sweating sickness anyway. Others would force themselves to vomit after every meal, convinced that purging their bodies would prevent the disease from taking hold. The 1528 epidemic spread beyond England for the first time, reaching the European continent. It tore through Germany, Switzerland, and Scandinavia with the same devastating speed it had shown in England. Entire monasteries were wiped out within days. Royal courts were decimated. The Holy Roman Emperor's court lost several high-ranking officials within a single week, all of them healthy men in their prime who went from perfect health to death in under a day. Hamburg lost over 1,000 people in 3 weeks. In some neighborhoods, so many people died so quickly that bodies were left in houses for days because there weren't enough healthy people left to carry them out for burial. The summer heat caused rapid decomposition, and the stench of death mixed with the sweet, rotten smell of the sweat that characterized the disease. Anne Boleyn, future wife of Henry VIII, contracted the sweating sickness in 1528. She survived, one of the lucky ones, but her experience left her traumatized. She wrote letters describing the terror of feeling the first sweat break, knowing she might be dead within hours, feeling her body temperature spike and her mind start to slip into delirium. She survived only because her servants followed the unconventional treatment of keeping her cool and awake, rather than following the standard medical advice of warmth and rest. The fifth and final outbreak in 1551 was the deadliest. It killed over 900 people in London in a single week. The disease had somehow become even more virulent, more deadly, more efficient at killing. The time from first symptom to death had shortened in some cases to as little as 3 hours. People would feel the first sweat and know they needed to make their peace with God immediately because they probably wouldn't survive to see the next sunrise. This final outbreak created such widespread panic that England's economy nearly collapsed. Markets closed because merchants refused to risk exposure. Ships wouldn't dock at English ports. Trade ground to a halt. The country was essentially quarantined by the rest of Europe, which did nothing to stop the disease but devastated England's economy for years afterward. Then it ended. The sweating sickness simply vanished after September 1551 and never returned. No final outbreak, no gradual decline, no evolution into a less deadly form. It just stopped, leaving behind thousands of corpses, traumatized survivors, and absolutely no answers about what it had been or why it left. Modern researchers have proposed dozens of theories: hantavirus, influenza, relapsing fever, even a form of anthrax. But none of these explanations fully account for the disease's unique symptoms, its selective targeting of healthy adults, its seasonal pattern, or its sudden and permanent disappearance. The sweating sickness remains one of history's great medical mysteries, a plague that killed thousands and then vanished without a trace. The psychological scars lasted for generations. For decades after the last outbreak, any fever or unusual sweating would trigger panic. Physicians continued to prescribe treatments for the sweating sickness long after it had disappeared, just in case it came back. The fear had become embedded in English culture, a collective trauma that wouldn't fade. But as terrifying as a disease that kills in hours might be, at least death came quickly. The next plague on our list offered no such mercy. Its victims would live for years, decades even, watching their bodies slowly fall apart while remaining fully conscious and aware. And society's response to these victims would prove that sometimes humans are far more monstrous than any disease. A man walked into his village church in 1200s France for what he thought was a regular Sunday service. Instead, he found the priest, his family, and most of the village waiting for him. They'd noticed the pale patches on his skin, the numbness in his fingers. They were there to attend his funeral, his own funeral, while he was still alive. The separation ritual for lepers was designed to be psychologically devastating. The priest would lead the suspected leper to the churchyard and force them to kneel beside a freshly dug grave. While the person knelt there, alive and aware, the priest would recite the burial service word for word. He'd throw dirt on the kneeling leper's head, the same dirt that would cover actual corpses. The message was clear. You are dead to us now, even though your body still breathes. After the mock funeral, the priest would hand the leper a wooden clapper, or bell. From that moment forward, they were required by law to announce their presence wherever they went. The sound of that clapper meant, "Unclean is approaching, stay away from me. I am the walking dead." Lepers who failed to use their clappers could be beaten, stoned, or killed outright by terrified villagers. But the social death was just the beginning of the nightmare. Leprosy, caused by Mycobacterium leprae, attacks the peripheral nervous system, slowly destroying the body's ability to feel pain. That might sound like a blessing, but it's actually a curse. Pain is your body's warning system. Without it, lepers would injure themselves constantly without realizing it until the damage was catastrophic. A leper might put their hand on a hot surface and not notice until they smelled their own flesh cooking. They'd walk on a splinter until it created an infected wound that destroyed the entire foot. They'd bite through their own lips and tongues while eating because they couldn't feel where their mouth was. The disease didn't directly cause limbs to fall off, but the combination of nerve damage and repeated injuries would lead to infections that would necessitate amputation or cause the tissue to become so damaged it would eventually detach. Medieval leper colonies, called leprosariums, were essentially open-air prisons where the condemned were left to rot together. These weren't hospitals with treatment or care. They were dumping grounds where society could hide the people it had declared legally and socially dead. Inside these colonies, the horrors multiplied because everyone was losing sensation and motor control simultaneously. Mealtimes in leprosariums were particularly grotesque. People with advanced leprosy would have lost parts of their faces, their noses, their lips, their palates. They'd be missing fingers, unable to properly grip utensils. Food would fall from mouths that could no longer close properly. Fingers and toes that had become gangrenous would occasionally fall off during meals, landing in communal food bowls. And because everyone had the disease, nobody could afford to be squeamish about continuing to eat. The facial deformities were especially horrific. Leprosy would cause the cartilage in the nose to collapse, leaving just a gaping hole in the center of the face. The disease would eat away at the bones of the jaw and palate, creating cavities where food would get stuck and rot, causing constant infections. Eyebrows and eyelashes would fall out. The skin would become thick and folded, creating a leonine appearance that medieval people found so disturbing they believed lepers had been transformed into beasts. Children born in leprosariums faced a particularly cruel fate. If they didn't have leprosy themselves, they were still marked as leper children and forbidden from leaving the colony. They'd grow up watching their parents slowly fall apart, knowing they were trapped in this hell despite being healthy. Some colonies would perform the separation ritual on these children anyway, declaring them socially dead, even though they showed no signs of disease, just to keep them confined. The sexual dynamics within leper colonies were disturbing and tragic. Lepers were still human, with human desires, but their bodies were falling apart. Attempts at intimacy would result in injuries neither partner could feel happening. Pregnancies in leper colonies often ended in disaster because women with advanced leprosy had lost sensation in their pelvic regions and wouldn't realize they were in labor until the baby was crowning, or complications had already become life-threatening. Medieval medical treatments for leprosy were useless at best and torturous at worst. Physicians would prescribe drinking mixtures containing mercury, which would poison patients and make them violently ill without affecting the disease. They'd recommend bloodletting, which would further weaken already fragile bodies. Some treatments involved applying caustic substances to the skin lesions, burning away healthy tissue along with the diseased portions. The Church taught that leprosy was divine punishment for sin, particularly sexual sin. This meant lepers weren't just suffering physically, they were carrying the psychological burden of believing God had personally cursed them. Priests would visit leprosariums to preach about repentance and redemption, telling people whose faces were falling off that they deserved their suffering because of their moral failures. But here's the twisted irony that makes this even more tragic. Most people diagnosed with leprosy in medieval Europe probably didn't have actual leprosy. The disease was rare, but the diagnosis was applied to anyone with unusual skin conditions, chronic wounds, or disfigurements. Eczema, psoriasis, syphilis, skin cancer, all of these could get you declared a leper and subjected to the separation ritual. Countless people were buried alive in their communities and sent to rot in leper colonies because of a misdiagnosis. Some lepers would live for decades in these colonies, slowly losing more and more of themselves. They'd watch their fingers disappear joint by joint over years. They'd feel their faces gradually collapse. They'd lose the ability to walk, then to use their hands, then to feed themselves, becoming completely dependent on other people who were also falling apart. And through it all, they remained conscious, aware, trapped in bodies that were betraying them in the slowest way possible. The smell in leprosariums was overwhelming and constant. Rotting flesh, infected wounds, gangrene, poor hygiene because people couldn't properly clean themselves with damaged hands. The stench would cling to the lepers' clothes and bodies, making them identifiable by smell, even before you could hear their clappers or see their deformities. Some colonies were located downwind from villages, specifically so the smell wouldn't reach the healthy population. By the late medieval period, there were thousands of leprosariums across Europe housing tens of thousands of people. These were entire populations of the living dead, people who'd been erased from society while their bodies took years or decades to finally give out. Some lepers would outlive multiple generations of their families, forgotten by everyone except the other inmates who were dying alongside them. The cruelest part of all, leprosy is actually one of the least contagious diseases known to medical science. About 95% of people are naturally immune to it. Medieval society destroyed thousands of lives, tore apart families, and created these nightmarish colonies to contain a disease that posed minimal actual risk of transmission. The real plague wasn't leprosy. It was fear, ignorance, and the human capacity for cruelty disguised as public health policy. But if leprosy showed how society could turn disease into a weapon against its own people, the next and final plague would demonstrate what happened when a disease was so deadly, so overwhelming, that it broke down every social structure and revealed the absolute worst of human nature when faced with mass death. London, 1348. A physician named Geoffrey made detailed notes as he performed an autopsy on a plague victim. What he found inside that corpse would haunt him for the rest of his short life. He'd be dead from the same disease within 3 months, but his notes survived, and they paint a picture of internal horror that makes every other medieval plague look merciful by comparison. The bubonic plague victim on Geoffrey's table was a wealthy merchant who died within 4 days of showing symptoms. From the outside, the most obvious signs were the buboes, swollen lymph nodes that had grown to the size of apples in the groin, armpits, and neck. These buboes were black or dark purple, filled with blood and pus under such pressure that they'd sometimes burst spontaneously, spraying infectious fluid across anyone nearby. But the external symptoms were nothing compared to what Geoffrey found inside. When he opened the chest cavity, the smell was so overpowering that his assistant fled the room vomiting. The lungs were partially liquefied, filled with bloody fluid that had essentially drowned the victim from the inside. The heart showed signs of hemorrhaging. The liver was spotted with black necrotic tissue. Every major organ had been attacked by the disease simultaneously. The most disturbing discovery was in the lymphatic system. The lymph nodes hadn't just swollen, they'd essentially exploded internally, releasing bacteria into the bloodstream. Geoffrey noted that cutting into a bubo released not just pus, but what he described as corrupted blood so black and thick it seemed more like tar than any human fluid. The bacterial load in these buboes was so high that the tissue had actually turned black from necrosis while the person was still alive. Jeffrey's notes describe finding subcutaneous hemorrhaging throughout the body, bleeding under the skin that created the characteristic black patches that gave the plague its name. In advanced cases, the bleeding was so extensive that the skin would split open spontaneously, releasing more infectious material. Some victims would literally come apart at the seams, their skin too damaged to hold together. But here's where the horror reaches its peak. Jeffrey discovered evidence that some plague victims had been buried alive. In his examination of multiple corpses, he found some with dirt under their fingernails, scratches on the inside surfaces of coffins, and body positions that suggested they'd been moving after burial. The plague could cause a coma-like state that mimicked death so closely that people would be pronounced dead and buried, only to wake up in their coffins and suffocate or starve to death underground. The mass graves from the Black Death period tell an even more disturbing story. Modern archaeological excavations of these plague pits reveal bodies thrown in with no ceremony, no organization, often without even removing their clothes. But more disturbing are the signs of deliberate mutilation on some corpses. People were so terrified of the dead rising or the disease spreading from corpses that they'd stab or dismember bodies before burial, just to make sure they stayed dead. Some plague pits contain evidence of burning. Authorities would throw lime or oil on bodies and set them on fire, trying to purify the corpses through burning. But medieval people didn't understand how to properly cremate bodies, so often these victims would be only partially burned, creating charred corpses that were then buried, half cremated. The archaeological evidence shows layers of ash mixed with partially burnt human remains, a testament to the desperation and horror of the time. The London Plague Pit, under what is now the Smithfield Market, contains an estimated 50,000 bodies. 50,000 people thrown into mass graves during a single outbreak. The archaeological team that excavated part of this site reported finding bodies stacked 5 deep in some places, with evidence that the gravediggers had been so overwhelmed they'd started hacking limbs off corpses to make them fit more efficiently into the available space. One of the most grotesque discoveries from plague pit excavations involves the bodies of pregnant women. Some had given birth during their final hours, the babies found still connected by umbilical cords, but clearly dead from the disease as well. The plague crossed the placental barrier, killing infants in the womb or immediately after birth. These tiny skeletons found alongside their mothers in mass graves represent entire family lines extinguished in days. Modern analysis of plague victim remains reveals just how agonizing the death process was. Bone marrow analysis shows extreme stress markers, indicating that victims were in constant severe pain during their final days. Dental analysis reveals stress lines that formed during the illness, permanent records in the teeth of just how much the body suffered before death. Some skeletons show evidence of self-inflicted injuries, where victims had clawed at their own buboes trying to release the pressure, tearing through skin and muscle in desperation. The social breakdown during major plague outbreaks created horrors beyond the disease itself. In Florence during the 1348 outbreak, chronicler Giovanni Boccaccio described scenes where families would abandon dying relatives in the streets to avoid contagion. He wrote of seeing bodies thrown from windows because nobody wanted to risk carrying a plague corpse through their house to the door. Packs of dogs would feed on corpses in the streets because there weren't enough living people to bury all the dead. Some cities tried to contain the plague by sealing infected houses with the inhabitants still inside. They'd nail boards over doors and windows, trapping entire families with their dying and dead relatives. Authorities would leave food at the doorstep, but many of these imprisoned families died not from plague, but from starvation, dehydration, or suicide. When these houses were eventually opened, investigators would find scenes of unimaginable horror. Decomposed bodies, evidence of cannibalism in some cases, and occasionally a survivor driven insane by weeks trapped with rotting corpses. The plague doctors, with their bird-like masks filled with herbs and spices, have become iconic images of medieval medicine. But what nobody mentions is that these doctors had one of the highest mortality rates of any profession. They'd visit dozens of plague victims per day, examining buboes, draining pus, handling infectious material constantly. Most plague doctors survived less than 6 months in the profession. Their masks didn't protect them. They just kept out some of the stench. The final grotesque irony of the Black Death? The treatments made everything worse. Physicians would lance buboes, spreading infection. They'd prescribe potions containing mercury and arsenic that would poison already dying patients. They'd recommend bloodletting for people who were already hemorrhaging internally. One popular treatment involved placing a live chicken against the buboes, believing the chicken would draw out the poison. All this accomplished was killing chickens and spreading more plague bacteria. The Black Death killed somewhere between 75 and 200 million people across Eurasia and North Africa. That's roughly 30 to 60% of Europe's population dead within 5 years. Entire villages were wiped out, their houses left empty until they collapsed from neglect. Some regions didn't recover their pre-plague population levels for over 200 years. The disease permanently altered European civilization, economy, religion, and culture. But perhaps the most disturbing legacy is this. Yersinia pestis, the bacteria that causes plague, still exists. It still infects thousands of people every year worldwide. With modern antibiotics, it's easily treatable, but without treatment, it's just as deadly as it was in the medieval period. The nightmare that killed millions is still out there, still waiting for the right conditions to return. The medieval plagues weren't just diseases. They were demonstrations of how fragile human civilization is, how quickly social order can collapse, and how the human body can be destroyed in the most grotesque ways imaginable. From dancing yourself to death, to sweating your life away in hours, from watching your limbs rot and fall off to being buried alive in a mass grave with thousands of others, these plagues showed that the medieval world wasn't dark because of lack of knowledge. It was dark because sometimes knowledge doesn't matter. Sometimes disease wins. And when it does, it reveals that underneath all our civilization and culture, we're just meat waiting to rot. The archaeological evidence, the historical accounts, and the medical records all tell the same story. Medieval plagues were worse than anything your textbooks ever described. They were personal, intimate horrors that turned the human body into a grotesque parody of itself before finally granting the mercy of death. And the worst part? We're not as far removed from that world as we'd like to believe. One mutation, one evolved pathogen, one failure of modern medicine, and we could find ourselves facing the same nightmares our ancestors did. The only difference is we'd have the internet to document it in real time as everything fell apart. The plagues that devastated medieval Europe taught us one fundamental truth that remains relevant today. Nature doesn't care about human civilization, human knowledge, or human suffering. When disease comes, it takes what it wants and leaves behind only corpses, trauma, and the haunting question of whether we'd handle it any better than our medieval ancestors did. Based on the evidence from recent pandemics, the answer might be more depressing than we're prepared to admit.